For 10 straight days, 10 consecutive nights, at the exact same time every night 3 o'clock in the morning. Then, the night Nancy vanished, the calls stopped cold. No explanation, no warning, no final message, just silence. Investigators had been working this case for months. They had witness statements, vehicle records, and a timeline assembled from dozens of interviews. They thought they understood what happened. They were wrong. Because, buried deep within communication records that had been sitting in a file for weeks, nearly dismissed, nearly overlooked, was a pattern so precise, so deliberate, so unsettling that it changed everything investigators thought they knew. And at the center of that pattern was one name, Annie Guthrie, and a direct line to the sheriff's office. Stay with me, because when investigators finally saw the full picture, the calls, the timing, the sudden ending, it revealed something unlike anything uncovered in this investigation before. The most shocking discovery wasn't that the calls existed. It was the possibility that a repeating pattern hidden in the timeline held answers investigators had missed for months. Now let's talk about Annie Guthrie. In any investigation, there are people at the center of the story: the victim, the primary suspects, and the key witnesses. Then there are people on the edges, people whose connection isn't obvious until someone takes a closer look. Annie Guthrie was one of those people. Her name didn't surface immediately. It wasn't in the first round of interviews, and she wasn't flagged in the initial reports. For weeks, possibly longer, she remained a background figure, a peripheral name investigators noted but never prioritized. That changed when the communication records arrived, and I want to be precise here, because precision matters in a story like this. What investigators were reviewing were records, communication logs, contact histories, the kind of data that shows when contact happened, how often it occurred, and whether it followed a pattern. They weren't necessarily looking for anything specific when they began reviewing them. This is standard investigative procedure. You pull records, examine them, and search for anything unusual. Most of the time, you find nothing. But this time, they found Annie Guthrie, and they found her tied to something that made investigators look far, far more closely. The connection wasn't violent. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't the kind of explosive revelation that cracks a case open overnight. It was quieter than that. It was a pattern of communication between Annie Guthrie and the sheriff's office. And once investigators saw it, once they realized what they were actually looking at, the questions began multiplying faster than they could answer them. Why was this communication happening? Why at that hour of the night? And most importantly, why did it stop the moment Nancy disappeared? If these communications were random, if they were ordinary, routine contact between two parties awake at unusual hours, you'd expect variation. Some nights at 3:15, some at 4 o'clock, some at 2:47, the natural randomness of human behavior. But that's not what the records showed. The records allegedly showed the same time, again and again, like something deliberate, something intentional, something decided in advance. Investigators began asking a question that would define the rest of this investigative thread. What kind of communication happens at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning for 10 consecutive nights, and then suddenly ends? Was it a scheduled check-in, a signal, something automated, or something else, something requiring a human being to stay awake at 3:33 every morning, maintaining contact for nearly 2 weeks? At this stage, investigators didn't have answers, but they had something almost as valuable. They had a pattern. And in investigative work, patterns are threads. You pull them carefully, you follow where they lead, you cross-reference them against everything else you know, which is exactly what investigators did next. 10 days, and then nothing. This is the part of the story that investigators considered most significant, and honestly, it's the part I keep coming back to, because patterns have a logic of their own, even strange patterns. Even patterns we don't immediately understand usually have an internal consistency, a reason even if it's hidden, even if it's not yet known, and consistent patterns rarely end without a reason. When something that has happened every single night for 10 days suddenly stops, it just stops. No gradual fade, no final communication, no explanation, the silence itself becomes a message. According to the narrative, the communications between Annie Guthrie and the sheriff's office came to a complete halt, not a slowdown, not a gap, a hard stop. And the timing of that hard stop allegedly coincided with Nancy's disappearance. Now, I want to be careful here, I want to be precise. Investigators were not, at this point, claiming the two events were definitely connected. Correlation is not causation. The timing could have been purely coincidental. If these communications were random, if they were ordinary, routine contact between two parties awake at unusual hours, you'd expect variation. Some nights at 3:15, some at 4 o'clock, some at 2:47, the natural randomness of human behavior. But that's not what the records showed. The records allegedly showed the same time, again and again, like something deliberate, something intentional, something decided in advance. Investigators began asking a question that would define the rest of this investigative thread. What kind of communication happens at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning for 10 consecutive nights, and then suddenly ends? Was it a scheduled check-in, a signal, something automated, or was it something else, something that required a human being to be awake at 3:33 every morning, maintaining contact for nearly 2 weeks? At this stage, investigators didn't have answers, but they had something almost as valuable. They had a pattern. And in investigative work, patterns are threads. You pull them carefully and follow wherever they lead. You cross-reference them against everything else you know, which is exactly what investigators did next. 10 days, and then nothing. This is the part of the story that investigators found most significant, and honestly, it's the part I keep returning to because patterns have their own logic, even strange patterns. Even patterns we don't immediately understand usually contain an internal consistency, a reason even if it's obscure, even if it's still unknown. And consistent patterns don't usually end without a reason. When something that has happened every night for 10 straight days suddenly stops, it just stops. No gradual fade, no final communication, no explanation. The silence at the end becomes a message of its own. According to the narrative, the communications between Annie Guthrie and the sheriff's office came to a complete halt, not a slowdown, not a pause, a hard stop. And the timing of that hard stop allegedly coincided with Nancy's disappearance. Now, I want to be careful here. I want to be precise. Investigators were not, at this point, asserting that the two events were definitively connected. Correlation is not causation. The timing could have been coincidental when you're working a missing person case. And when you're dealing with a disappearance that doesn't immediately make sense, one of the most powerful tools investigators have is timeline reconstruction. You take every piece of data available, every timestamp, every sighting, every movement record, and lay them side by side. You look for gaps. You look for overlaps. You search for the moments where separate threads collide, because that's where answers often hide. Investigators took what they now knew about the 3:33 communications and began aligning them with everything else on the timeline. Phone records, not just the Guthrie records, but every phone record tied to the case. Who called whom, when, and for how long. The digital footprint of human connection mapped across the days leading up to Nancy's disappearance. Vehicle movements. In investigations, cars are extraordinarily valuable. They place people, they establish presence. A vehicle spotted somewhere unexpected or somewhere ordinary that becomes significant in context can change everything. Investigators began cross-referencing known vehicle activity against the timeline they were building. Witness accounts, the human element, people who saw things, heard things, noticed things, even details they didn't realize mattered at the time. When you carefully reconstruct a timeline, and then return to witnesses with specific questions, where were you at 3 o'clock in the morning on this exact date? Sometimes answers emerge that never surfaced during the initial interview, along with other events. The broader context of the investigation, things that happened in the days before the disappearance that now look different in light of what was known about the communications. What investigators were searching for was overlap. Were any of these 3 o'clock in the morning communications connected to other events on the timeline? Was a vehicle movement recorded near the time of a communication? Was there a witness account that intersected with a pattern? This is painstaking work. It doesn't happen quickly, and it doesn't always produce immediate answers. Sometimes, you spend days cross-referencing data only to discover that two things that seemed connected are actually completely unrelated. But sometimes, you discover that two separate threads are actually one and the same. According to the investigation's narrative, reconstructing the timeline around the 3:33 a.m. communications created a far more complicated picture than investigators originally expected. The communications didn't exist in isolation. They existed within a larger web of activity, movements, contacts, and events that together told a story. And the more investigators mapped that environment, the more questions surfaced. Specifically, were the communications reactive, meaning they were responses to something already happening? Or were they initiating, meaning they were the first step in a sequence that unfolded afterward? That distinction matters enormously. If the communications were reactive, then the explanation lies somewhere else on the timeline, some other event that triggered the contact. If they were initiating, if they represented the first move in a sequence, then whatever followed becomes the focal point. Investigators were trying to determine which was true, and they still weren't sure. What they were increasingly convinced of was this: the 3 o'clock in the morning communications were not random, not accidental, and not insignificant. Whether they were connected to Nancy's disappearance remained an open question, but the idea that they could simply be ignored, filed away as irrelevant, or dismissed as coincidence was no longer an option. These communications had become a central thread in the investigation, And that thread led straight to Annie Guthrie. Here's the reality of complex investigations. The closer you look, the more you uncover, and not always in the way you'd hope. Sometimes, the evidence doesn't solve the mystery. It deepens it. What investigators encountered as they continued examining the communications involving Annie Guthrie and the sheriff's office was exactly that phenomenon. The deeper they looked, the more questions emerged, because the communications themselves, the timestamps, the pattern, the abrupt ending didn't reveal what had actually been communicated. They proved contact occurred. They proved when it occurred. They proved there was a pattern. But they didn't immediately reveal the purpose, and purpose is everything in an investigation. A communication at 3 o'clock in the morning, between two parties could mean 100 different things. It could be completely innocent, a person struggling with insomnia, a scheduled notification, a work-related obligation that happened to occur in the middle of the night, something automated, something technical, something with an entirely ordinary explanation. But it could also mean something more. It could suggest that two parties maintained contact at a time deliberately chosen, because most people wouldn't notice it a time selected for its obscurity, its off-hour nature, its distance from the hours when people are awake, alert, and paying attention. Investigators couldn't yet determine which interpretation was correct, and that uncertainty, that space between innocent and significant, is exactly where an investigation can stall. That's one reason the communications inquiry became such a significant standalone thread, because it added an entirely new layer of complexity to a case that was already complicated. Before this discovery, investigators had a set of questions about Nancy's disappearance: the who, the what, the where, and the why. Now, layered on top of those questions, were new ones. What was the purpose of the 3:33 a.m. communications? Who initiated them? Were they connected to Nancy, or merely coincidentally adjacent to her disappearance? Was Annie Guthrie aware of the significance of what investigators were now examining? And perhaps most importantly, what explanation existed for why the communications stopped when they did? This final question kept resurfacing, because most things have explanations. People stopped calling because they got what they needed, because circumstances changed, because a relationship ended, or because something happened that made further communication impossible or unnecessary. But in the context of this investigation, with a missing person on one side of the timeline and a sudden communication shutdown on the other, the reason those calls ended wasn't obvious. And investigators weren't ready to accept that there was no connection. Not yet. What they were left with, at this stage of the investigation, was a symbol, not a solution. Not an answer, but a symbol. The 3 o'clock in the morning calls had become the embodiment of everything this case was struggling with: the secrecy, the unanswered questions, the frustrating gap between knowing something mattered and understanding why it mattered. This is true crime in its most honest form. It doesn't always end with a clean resolution. Sometimes one thread leads to several more. Sometimes, the discovery that seems destined to solve the case only makes it deeper. And sometimes the most important thing an investigation uncovers isn't the answer, it's the question nobody thought to ask. Let's step back for a moment, because I want to talk about why this particular detail, the 3 o'clock in the morning pattern, became so central to how people understood this case. Because it wasn't just investigative significance, there was something psychologically gripping about it, something that makes it linger in your mind in a way many case details never do. Part of that is the precision. 3 o'clock in the morning isn't a vague window of time. It's not sometime in the middle of the night. It's an exact moment, an exact number. The triple repetition of it, 3:33, gives it a visual and numerical quality that's difficult to ignore. When you see it written down, when you hear it spoken aloud, there's a pattern embedded within the pattern itself. That level of specificity does something to the brain. It signals that this wasn't random. Random events don't repeat with this kind of precision. Randomness varies. Chaos has texture, but repetition at the exact same minute, across 10 consecutive days, suggests intention. And in a missing person investigation, intention may be the most important word of all. Part of it is the timing itself. 3 o'clock in the morning occupies a unique place in the collective imagination. It's deep in the night, the hour often referred to in popular culture as the witching hour, the time associated with things that happen unseen, hidden in the darkness. That cultural association isn't evidence of anything, and it doesn't prove or disprove what those communications meant, but it adds weight to the unease. When people learned investigators had uncovered a recurring pattern of communication at 3 o'clock in the morning in the days before a woman vanished, the reaction wasn't confusion. It was recognition, a quiet, deeply unsettled recognition that this detail felt important long before anyone could definitively prove it was. And then there's the stopping. That's the part I keep coming back to, the part that carries the greatest emotional weight. 10 days of contact, consistent, precise, unexplained, and then a hard stop the night Nancy disappeared. I don't know how else to describe what it feels like to sit with that information except to say it creates the feeling of something interrupted, something abruptly cut off, like a sentence ending in the middle of a word. The communications were saying something. Whatever they were, whatever purpose they served, they were active, a living part of whatever was unfolding. And then they weren't. The silence left behind wasn't merely silence, it was a question. Investigators understood that. That's why the communications, despite lacking a definitive explanation, became such a major focal point. Because sometimes, the shape of a mystery is what guides you through it. The unanswered question at the center of this case: why did communication that had been so consistent suddenly stop, at the exact moment everything else seemed to stop as well, was more than an investigative puzzle. It was the story of Nancy's disappearance told through absence, told through what was no longer there. That's what Annie Guthrie's connection to this timeline represented, at least at this stage of the investigation. Not guilt, not certainty, not a solved case, but a thread connecting a pattern of late-night communication to a disappearance, placing the name Annie Guthrie at the center of a sequence of events that investigators were still struggling to fully understand, and demanding answers that had yet to arrive. Let me explain why this kind of discovery, a pattern buried in communication records, is potentially so significant from an investigative perspective. Because it's easy to hear a story like this and focus on the drama, the late-night calls, the strange number, the abrupt ending. And yes, those details are dramatic, they're worth attention, but the deeper significance is procedural, more technical, and in many ways more important. Communication records don't lie, people lie, witnesses misremember, evidence becomes contaminated, timelines get distorted by human error and selective memory, but a timestamp in a communication log is a timestamp. It exists independently of what anyone claims happened. It was recorded automatically by a system with no stake in the outcome. It doesn't change based on someone's story. That's why investigators treat communication records seriously, even when the content of those communications remains unknown. The existence of contact at a specific time is objective data, and when that objective data forms a pattern, when it tells a story that complicates or contradicts someone's account, it becomes an extraordinarily powerful investigative tool. In the case of the 3 o'clock in the morning communications, investigators had objective documentation of something that had never previously been disclosed. That doesn't prove wrongdoing, and it doesn't establish guilt. But it does establish that something was happening, something occurring at an unusual hour, repeating with unusual precision, and ending at an unusual moment. Something that someone, at some point, chose not to mention. And that's where the investigative stakes become truly significant. Because, in a missing person case, the absence of information can be just as important as its presence. Every person connected to the case, every individual within the broader circle who knew the victim, crossed paths with her life, or had any proximity to the events surrounding her disappearance, every one of them has a responsibility to be forthcoming with investigators, not because they're suspects, but because details matter. Context matters. Even details that seem irrelevant. Even communication logs from 3 o'clock in the morning that may appear unrelated, may seem too strange to explain, may feel embarrassing or complicated. All of it matters. And when a pattern like this surfaces, when investigators discover it in records rather than hearing about it voluntarily, it raises a question beyond simply what these communications were about. It raises another question. Why wasn't this information disclosed? Investigators weren't necessarily assuming bad faith. There are plenty of reasons people fail to volunteer information that have nothing to do with guilt or deception, fear, confusion, not realizing the information could be relevant, the very human instinct to avoid scrutiny, even when completely innocent. But those possibilities had to be examined, and that examination, that careful, methodical process of understanding why a 10-day pattern of 3:33 a.m. communications existed, and then abruptly stopped, became one of the defining threads of this investigation. We've traveled through this story from the discovery of the pattern, to the reconstruction of the timeline, to the deeper questions surrounding what Annie Guthrie's connection to all of this truly means. And I want to be honest about where we stand. We don't have all the answers. That's not a failure of the story. It's the reality of the investigation. This is one of those cases where uncovering a significant detail doesn't close the door, it opens it wider. It creates new lines of inquiry branching in multiple directions. It raises questions that, once asked, can't be ignored. Why was communication happening at 3 o'clock in the morning? What was the context of those communications? Why that specific time for 10 consecutive nights? What was happening in Annie Guthrie's life, and in the life of whoever she was communicating with at the sheriff's office during those 10 days? And then there's the central question, the one hanging over everything like a held breath. Was the timing of that communication shutdown truly a coincidence? Investigators believed, and believed is the key word here, that the answer was no. that the abrupt ending of the communications was connected to Nancy's disappearance in a way not yet fully understood, that a pattern ending so precisely at that moment was pointing toward something, perhaps an explanation, perhaps a person, perhaps a set of circumstances that, once fully understood, would reshape everything people thought they knew about how Nancy disappeared and what happened to her afterward. This is the nature of complex investigations. They aren't linear. They don't move in a straight line from mystery to resolution. They loop back, they double back, and they uncover details that remained invisible until someone viewed them from exactly the right angle. The 3 o'clock in the morning communications were exactly that kind of detail hidden in plain sight, sitting in a file, waiting until someone looked closely enough, until someone asked the right question. And the question investigators were now asking, the question this entire case had begun to revolve around, was whether the answer to why those communications existed, and why they suddenly stopped, could finally give Nancy's story the clarity it deserved. That's what was at stake, not just an investigative lead, but a person, a life, and an answer that someone, somewhere, was still holding. Here's what I want you to take away from all of this. The most sophisticated piece of evidence in this case didn't come from a crime scene. It didn't come from a witness breaking down and finally telling the truth. It came from a pattern, a repeating, precise 10-night sequence of communication at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning that ended the very night a woman disappeared. The most startling discovery wasn't that the calls occurred. It was the possibility that a repeating pattern buried in the timeline contained answers investigators had overlooked for months. Details like this, small, technical, easy to miss, are often the ones that break a case wide open, not because they're dramatic on their own, but because they exist in the space between what someone says happened and what actually happened. And that space, that's where the truth lives. This investigation is still ongoing. There are answers still being pursued. There are threads still being followed, and the question of what those 3:33 a.m. communications truly meant, what Annie Guthrie's connection to the sheriff's office during those days actually represented, remains unresolved. But the fact that the pattern was discovered, the fact that investigators are now examining this lead with the seriousness it deserves, means Nancy's story isn't over. It means someone is still searching. If you want to stay with this case, if you want to know what investigators uncovered when they dug deeper into the timeline reconstruction, and what their conversations with Annie Guthrie ultimately revealed, make sure you're subscribed, turn on notifications, and if you found this video valuable, share it. Because the best way to keep pressure on an investigation is to keep people paying attention. Nancy deserves that attention, and so does the truth.